My privilege to introduce to you of Jeffrey Jurgens from Sterling and Northrop. He will answer all your questions, so we're going to get ready to roll. Jeff?
All right. Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? All right, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Jurgens. I'm an attorney with the law firm Sterling Northrop, and we're here today just to talk about some basic issues in township government. The first question before we get started is a common question that you may or may not have received before, but a lot of you as township officials probably do receive this question, which is, what is township government? Somebody says they're from the fire protection district. They know what the fire protection district does. They provide fire protection services. Somebody says they're from the school board. Well, they know that the school board and the school district provides education services. Or the city, well, everybody knows what a city does. They provide water services, police protection, clean our streets, provide our water, those types of things. But you tell somebody you're from the township, that you're the township supervisor, or you're a township trustee or the highway commissioner, people might ask you, well, what exactly does township government do? And if somebody were to ask you that, does anybody have what they think would be a great answer or response? All right.
We maintain rural roadways, provide general assistance, help the constituents with drainage issues, and give voice to Springfield.
All right, so the response over here was they maintain the roads, they provide general assistance, they help with drainage issues, help make sure people have a voice in Springfield, and those certainly are all things that township governments do. Does anybody else have their own kind of routine answer for what is township government? Yes?
We also have a water department.
Also, their township has a water department, and some townships do provide water service. Yes?
Cemeteries, we operate food.
The response back there was cemeteries. Some townships provide cemeteries. A lot of townships provide cemeteries, yes.
Parks and seniors.
Help provide senior programs. So we're getting a lot of different things, and no two townships in here may be the same, we'll learn today. That every township is a little bit different. It somehow makes the answer of what is township government a little hard to answer exactly. But I've tried to break it down like this. And tried to come up with the acronym of GEARS. So what is township government? First, it's providing general assistance. General assistance is a program administered by the township supervisor, and it provides help to the needy in your township and community. I also have up here the E stands for electors. Townships cannot forget that there is direct participation in this government, that the electors are the ones who make a lot of the orders and a lot of the decisions regarding township government. So it's kind of a direct democracy in a lot of aspects. We also have assessments. One of the things that we missed when we were talking ago is that the townships are responsible for making tax assessments within your township. We got roads. Obviously, the township is responsible for maintaining roads and highways within the township jurisdiction. And then finally, services. And services that we'll talk today is that last kind of thing. You heard some people talking about cemeteries, about senior programs, other types of things that townships provide. So when you look at it, township is really about providing general assistance. It's about working directly with the electors and the people. It's about providing tax assessments. It's about maintaining the roads. And it's about providing various other services that kind of fall through the gaps of other units of local government, where the township is kind of this direct democracy at the local level, can step in, evaluate the needs, and provide various services for the constituency within your township. Breaking that down a little bit further, there are 3 statutory functions that we talked about. This is by statute what your township is supposed to be doing, has to do. One is providing general assistance. One is providing assessment of real property, and the other is maintaining roads. So those are by statute the duties that have been assigned to each township. Now, again, the general assistance, that program is administered by your township supervisor. One of the things we'll talk about today is they're the ones in charge of general assistance. The next is assessment of real property. Again, that's handled by the township assessor. Some of you may have elected assessors, some of you may contract for an assessor, some of you might have multi-townships where you share an assessor. But it's the assessor that does that function of assessing real property. And then finally, maintaining roads. And again, it's the highway commissioner within your road district or your township that is in charge of the roads. The other part of township government then is the services and basically helping people within your township. And I've listed just a few of the different programs that townships can do within their township. For example, senior citizen programs, youth programs, transportation programs, helping the disabled, providing parks and recreation, providing health services, cemeteries, another issue that we talked about before. So there are all different kinds of things that your township can do. All of these different functions. And not every township is going to do all of these functions. Maybe your township just concentrates on providing a food pantry, and that's fine. That's really what your community needs. Maybe other townships focus on having a transportation program where they can help people get to where they need to go, maybe help the sick or the elderly or the poor to get to jobs or to doctors or those kinds of things. And so townships will create transportation programs. It's really dependent on what your township needs. These functions, these services, are really provided for in one area of the township code. It's known as section 85-13, and it's part of the handout. I've actually copied the statute for you, but it talks about the fact that your township board can spend money for these various functions. You've got the authority to spend this money. You don't have to go through the electors. You've got the authority to do these programs. Your township board does. So if you want to start a food pantry program, you can do that. You don't have to have a special town meeting. You don't have to get the electors involved. You just have to budget for it and go out there and do it. And if you don't want to spend the money directly to do it, if you don't want to open up a food pantry in your township hall, this statute also allows for you to enter into an agreement with a nonprofit agency, and you can give that nonprofit some money to help run their food pantry program or their youth program or their drug program, whatever it might be. So those are options. You can always enter into an agreement with another government entity or with another nonprofit entity as long as it's been in existence for a year, and then you can do these types of programs. So really the first step is kind of evaluating what different types of needs do we have here in the township. Do we have a large need of unemployed? Maybe we need some unemployment workshops or some food pantries. Do we have a bad transportation within the township? Maybe we need to look into transportation programs. Maybe we can't afford it all by ourselves, but we could go together with the county or with some neighboring townships, and we could create a program like that to help our citizens. So you really look at and evaluate the different needs of your township. We have a question back here. Yes?
Yeah, going back one PowerPoint, what type of nuisances are you referring to?
The question up here is abating, one of the types of programs is abating nuisances. The township code allows you to declare nuisances. Also, in certain cases, allows you to condemn property. I've had some townships that have, they've got such dilapidated property in their township that they're looking at taking some action to condemn the property and get it torn down. So if you've got weeds and different things like that, if you've got property issues within your township, look into it. There might be various programs, various codes you could enforce, and things you could do to help clean up your township to make it not only to look better, but to help increase the property values of neighboring homes. We all know in this day and age we've had a lot of foreclosures, a lot of people just abandon their house, and so sometimes there is a need for this. And if your township is in unincorporated county somewhere, the county might not be taking care of these issues. You've got no municipality to take care of these issues, so you then look to the township to help take care of these issues. All right, so looking at all of these different programs you can do, we're going to do just kind of an example of this. What your township can do. What are you doing? One of the things that I would always recommend is look and see what kind of press coverage you're getting. Are you getting any press coverage? Are you getting negative stories about you? Are there stories being written about how the township wastes money, how it's not doing anything, or how officials are conducting misconduct or not operating ethically? Are those types of things going on? Or is your township getting good press? Are you getting stories about the food pantry or the local program that you're doing for the youth, for after school, for those types of things? Are you getting people at your township board meeting that are discussing one issue or the other? Those are all things that can maybe kind of help you evaluate where you've been and where you want to go and what you need to do. And I point to an example of Decatur Township, which is just down the road in Macon County. We all know we had an election in April. In Decatur Township, they had new people elected to all of the positions. New supervisor, 4 new trustees, except for the township clerk, she remained the same. New highway commissioner, new assessor. So we had all new officials elected into these positions. Well, the previous board, just about every story you would see in the newspaper was negative. They were fighting. Nobody could agree on anything. Everybody was questioning everything. Problem after problem after problem. Decatur Township is a big township. They had news reporters at every meeting. They covered a lot of things, and it was primarily all negative. Well, we had an election. We got new people elected, and with that election, we had kind of a change in leadership. What do we want to accomplish now? We know what's been happening here. How can we change that and make that better? So the new people that came into office said, we want to make things different. We want to get back to helping the people and evaluating what we as a township should be doing. In Decatur Township, in Macon County, they've got the highest unemployment in the state of Illinois. They made 10, 12%. It's a very high unemployment. A lot of problems, a lot of issues going on in the township with a variety of social ills. And so they looked at, okay, what can we be doing? And they started to turn their focus on issues like job fairs and job programs, programs to help those with criminal records try and get over those records and get jobs. They hired a community coordinator, somebody to coordinate the various programs in Macon County with them. They started looking at providing grants to various nonprofit groups within the township that are doing things like helping schools, helping children after school, or helping with drug addiction and those types of things. So they really kind of turned the ship, and not to say everything's perfect or there's not disagreements on some of these things, but they really turned the ship to focus on what is it that we as the township can be doing to help the people that elected us. There's a lot of needs here. We've got a lot of discretion in what we can do. Let's go out there and do it and make things better and make things different. And so that's what they've tried to do. They held a special meeting where they invited all of the electors, everybody to come, and you tell us, township citizens, what do you think we should be doing? What programs would you like us to see us investing in? What concerns do you have? Now, that was an interesting meeting. They got people from other townships that came and asked for bridges and various things. But when they sorted through it all, they did get some good feedback, and it was a chance to really open a dialogue with the citizens of the township. So again, look at all of these various programs that are out there and look at your needs and see what it is that you can be doing. And then, once you make these determinants, get busy making it do it, making it happen, getting some of these programs in order. With that, as a quick overview of some of the different things that your township government is supposed to be doing by statute and other things by basically evaluation and need, I want to turn just a little bit to the interrelationship between the various township officials. And we'll start with the township supervisor. How many supervisors do we have in the room? Okay, so quite a few. The supervisor is essentially the CEO of the township. The supervisor basically is in charge for running the day-to-day operations. They're considered the chairman of the board. They are the road district treasurer. One of their most important duties is to be the supervisor of general assistance, which means that they set the general assistance limits, they hire general assistance employees, and they make those types of determinations and run that program. The township supervisor has the authority to appoint an attorney. However, to make that appointment, you have to get the advice and consent of the township board. So while the supervisor does appoint the attorney, they need to get buy-in from the board on that. Some specific duties, they pay out and receive all of the monies, they prepare various reports, and they keep the accounts. So the supervisor plays obviously a very important and vital role within the township. That being said, we should note here that the supervisor has no kind of independent authority. They have to get the board to approve the bills. They have no authority over the highway commissioner. They have no authority over the assessor. But they obviously play a role in helping to formulate a lot of the transactions that go on within the township. The township board, again, we talked about the supervisor being the chairman of the board. The township board basically implements the statutory duties. They also implement the orders of the electors. So if the electors get together and say, we want to sell this piece of property, they then turn it over to the board who makes that happen. Or they make some other determination. The township board then basically implements that action. Of course, you're aware that the board approves the bills. Probably at all of your meetings, you pass around the bills, you review them as trustees, and you approve those and sign off on them. The township board hires township employees. So, for example, if your township has an administrator, it's the township board that's going to hire that person. Or if you have a receptionist, it's the township board that's going to hire that person. So they do have a role in handling some of the employees. Of course, they also approve the budget and the tax levy. Is there a question over here?
The supervisor has no authority to veto once you made a motion either and approve it.
Correct. The question here is, does the supervisor has no authority to veto? And that is correct. Unlike a mayor in a city who has veto authority, the supervisor has no veto authority. So if a majority of the township board approves something, it is approved. You then have to go back to the drawing board and maybe work and try and change the minds of some of the trustees. But no, there is no independent veto authority. Yes?
On the tax levy, is that just for the township levy, or is that also the highway department levy?
Question on the tax levy, is that just for the township or is it also the road district? It is both. And here's where, we'll take just a second here. We might touch briefly on this later. But the budget and the tax levy. The highway commissioner submits a budget, and the township board has discretion to approve that budget or to modify it. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of minutes. As to the tax levy, the highway commissioner submits that tax levy. The township board has to approve what was submitted as the tax levy. So it's the township board that ultimately approves the tax levy, but it first initiates with the highway commissioner. Going on to the clerk. The clerk, obviously, another vital, important player within the township. They are the custodian of the records. They are the clerk of the township board. They do not vote on the township board except in one limited circumstance, which is if there's a vacancy on the township board. So if there's a vacancy and there's a tie, then the clerk gets to vote. Otherwise, the clerk never votes. There's got to be a tie in the vacancy vote. They also serve as the ex officio clerk of the road district. And again, as I said, they maintain the files. And this can sometimes become a problem in terms of somebody trying to take jurisdiction of the files. Maybe a supervisor tries to lock the files in his or her office, and the clerk says, hey, wait a second, I'm supposed to have those in my office. Technically, if you look at the statute, it's the clerk should be the one responsible for those files. Typically, in those situations, I say, really, supervisor, you need to let the clerk have them, because if something happens to them, you don't want to be responsible for them. Make the clerk responsible for them, for their safekeeping. Now we'll talk just a little bit about the highway commissioner and the assessor. How many highway commissioners do we have? Just a couple. How many of you think you're the highway commissioner? Well, we only have 2 real highway commissioners. And the highway commissioner and the road district, they're kind of their own separate legal entity. They do not have a board that has to approve, what they're doing. The highway commissioner doesn't have to come to you and say, hey, I want to pave this road Are you guys okay with it? No, the highway commissioners got their own independent jurisdiction and authority to do something like that. However, they're independent, but they're still kind of connected to the township because the township board has to approve their bills. As we just talked about, they have to approve their budget, they have to approve their tax levy, and so they're still very much connected. Now, we talked about the budget. If a highway commissioner submits a budget, and you'll find it surprising, but sometimes the highway commissioner and the township board doesn't always get along, and so you might have a situation where the highway commissioner submits a budget for, let's say, $100,000, and the township board says, oh, that's way too high, we don't like you, you're not out there doing anything anyway, and you really screwed up that one road, we're going to cut the budget to $50,000. And they only approve a $50,000 budget. Well, what the highway commissioner is going to do in that situation is likely file a lawsuit against the township and say, look, I need $100,000 to do my statutory functions, to be out there plowing the snow, to buy the salt, to get the pavement, to do all of these various things. I can't do it for $50,000. I need $100,000. And if he can show that the court, yeah, that's right, then the court's going to say, board, you've got the authority to approve the budget, but you can't do it like that. You've got to give them $100,000. So you've got to be careful with this. And while you might say, look, our levy's down, our revenues are down, maybe we can give you $95,000, but we're just cutting everywhere. We can't quite give you $100,000. That he's probably going to lose on. He probably needs to make some cuts too. But if, you can't just completely slash it and expect the highway commissioner to go out there and operate and not get challenged on it. So my advice in this arena is always not to play politics. Look at the numbers, look and see what's reasonable, have an open dialogue and communication with the highway commissioner, but don't just go out there and completely slash the budget and expect good things to happen. And the exact same thing is true with the assessor. That you've got to, the assessor can come to you and submit a budget. You got to look and see, is it reasonable? Does the assessor really need this money to operate? If everybody else is cutting, if you think she's got way too much, you could go out and you can perhaps try and work with her. The board's got the ultimate approval, but don't give them an opening to go to court and challenge it, and you end up losing and paying for their attorney fees as well. Because if there's a conflict in a situation like this, the court is going to say that the township is responsible for paying the assessor's attorney fees or the highway commissioner's attorney fees. So be wary of that. Try and, like I said, work out those types of issues well in advance. Now, yes?
On the part where it says the assessor, we have a contracted assessor who hires her husband, which helps her a lot. And we had a problem with him until we got a new board member. Now, he wants everything. He don't want us to even have anything to do with that worker, not have him cover under torma or anything like that. Do you see a problem with her hiring her husband? And a lot of them in our area do hire their spouses.
The question is, they've got you can either elect an assessor, or if nobody's qualified, then you can contract with one. And so in this township, they've contracted with one, and the person they've contracted for hires their spouse to do some of the work. And that's probably not illegal per se. Is it the best practice? Probably not. Excuse me, but a lot of it's going to depend on what your contract says. There are a lot of times where the contract, and I just did an assessor contract not too long ago, where we really were very clearly tried to set forth all of the different parameters of how it was going to operate, how she was going to spend money, how much money she was going to get, how it had to be approved by the board. Because if you're contracting with an assessor, you've got a lot more authority over that office than if you've got an elected assessor. So from the township's perspective, that's a good thing. And there are a lot of situations where, and I've had highway commissioners who have used their wife for bookkeeping and those kinds of things. No, I don't think it's technically illegal. and a lot of times it makes sense, and you can actually do it cheaper than if you were out there hiring somebody. But certainly it's an issue you want to pay attention to. One of the issues we'll talk about later is anti-nepotism policies, which is always something I recommend, where your township basically adopts a policy that says you can't hire relatives, spouses, children, immediate family like that, and helps keep everything clean and avoid those conflict issues. So it's basically an internal township policy as opposed to any law. Two other important things, and we'll talk about this later too, but if the highway commissioner has more than 5 employees, you have to have 5 or more, you have to have a personnel manual. If you have, the assessor has 5 or more employees, you have to have a personnel manual. If the general assistance department has 5 or more employees, personnel manual. If the township board has 5 or more employees, personnel manual. Even if you don't have 5 or more employees, I would recommend you have a personnel manual. Something that sets forth vacation time, sick time, holidays, all the various things that your employees need to know that kind of formulate that contract, so to speak, and the expectations for your employees. But if you have 5 or more in any of those situations, you need to have a personnel manual. Yes?
I'm a part of a new board. Everyone was newly elected except for the highway commissioner. And they didn't have personnel manuals, but now we want to implement them. What can we do with the existing employees?
Well, the question is, it's a new board came in. They did not have the personnel manuals, but the new board wants personnel manuals. What can they do now with the existing employees? You can adopt personnel manuals and make it applicable to your existing employees. Presumably, they're at-will employees, that they're not under any contract, that they're not under any union agreement. If that's the case, then you would basically enact these new policies and make them subject to it. And we'll talk a little bit about unions in a couple of minutes, but if that's the situation, then yes, you can by law, if you've got 5 or more, you've got to have them anyway. If you're just thinking it's good practice, we don't quite have that many employees, yeah, I'd still go ahead and adopt some personnel policies. Yes?
And it doesn't matter whether they're full or part-time.
That's right. If I have 5 employees, and I've always been of the position that if it's part-time or full-time, it really shouldn't matter. And sometimes you have seasonal employees. I would err on the side of caution and have those personnel manuals. Yes?
Our township is in the process of adopting these policies, and we're having a separate one for part-time and full-time employees.
Yes, he said their township is in the process of adopting these, and they have basically separate ones for part-time versus full-time employees. Now, what do you do if you're the township board? Yeah, I agree, we've got to have these, but my assessor's got 10 employees and she's refusing to do it. Or my highway commissioner's got 7 employees and he's refusing to do it. This issue comes up a lot. I think you need to make sure they know the law. Have your attorney, send them something in writing saying, this is the law, you've got to do this, you need to do this. And, you can try and prod them on that. But you cannot force policies on the assessor or the highway commissioner. They need to be the ones that are responsible for adopting those policies. They'll be the ones accountable if they don't adopt those policies. Larry, do you have a question?
You answered it.
Okay. Cemetery board, another entity kind of within the township. How many of you have cemetery boards under the Public Graveyards Act or cemetery trustees? So quite a few of you. Cemeteries can be very confusing. There are various ways that you can own and operate cemeteries. I'd say the most common is under the Public Graveyard Act, which allows a township to create a cemetery board and vest control of the cemetery with 3 appointed trustees. The cemetery board is still subject to FOIA and the Open Meetings Act. So if you've got 3 cemetery trustees, no 2 of them should ever be talking about cemetery business unless it's at an agended public meeting. It's kind of hard to think about that or to comply with that sometimes, but that's what the law is, and they should not be violating that law. Also, if you've got a cemetery board, the supervisor is still the one that receives the money and pays out the money. The township board is still the one that's basically approving their budget. So the cemetery board, yes, it's got power, it's vested control of the cemetery with these 3 trustees. A lot of them, they do the hiring and firing of employees, but they're not completely divested of the township. There's still a lot of involvement with the supervisor and still a lot of involvement with the township board. The final piece of the puzzle is the electors. And a lot of times we forget about the electors. We're out there kind of doing our own thing. We're doing various programs, various other things, and we think, oh yeah, well, we have to have an annual meeting in April, then we'll get to see the electors, which maybe it's just going to be, the supervisor, the board, and their spouses, and the highway commissioner, and, and his spouse or something. But the electors really have a lot of power and control within the township, and it's very important that we don't forget about them. Based on the township code and the cases, they basically got the power to take all necessary measures and give direction to the township board for the exercise of the township's corporate powers. And there are various things within the township code that they specifically control. One of the most important things that we'll talk about today is property. The electors, real property. The electors basically have complete control over real property. So if you're at a township board meeting and one of the trustees says, this piece of property just came up for sale down the road, it'd make a much better township hall. I've got a friend that's a realtor, let's put this place up for sale. Let's go make an offer on that. All in favor say aye, yeah, okay. And you go out there and you try and sell your piece of property and you try and buy the one down the road. That's not going to work because for property, you've got to have the authority of the electors, and we'll talk about that in a second. All right, so we talked about all of these various players on the township team. For lack of a better analogy, we'll kind of look at this as a baseball team. Maybe the pitcher is the supervisor, maybe your catcher is the clerk, maybe you got the 4 trustees as the first baseman, the second baseman, shortstop, third base, got the highway commissioner and the assessor and outfield. Maybe you consider the coach to be the electors. They're kind of the ones, given some of the direction. But there's a lot of different moving pieces to township government and a lot of different players. And when you kind of step back and you look at all of these different players, there's a lot of different things going on. So thinking about it that way, how do we make our township government succeed? One, I think, is to understand your role in the township government. What is your role on the team? Because the pitcher has a much different role than the catcher or the shortstop or the first baseman. Everybody's got to understand their role and know how to play it. If you've got a trustee that just hates the highway commissioner and wants to completely run the road district, that's not going to make for a very conducive township. They're going to have problems, or maybe it's the supervisor or somebody else that's that's like that. But it's not uncommon in township government for various officials to have a problem with the way somebody else is doing their job. Part of that's just human nature, that's fine, but make sure that you understand what your role is, and maybe you try and make that other person help understand what their role is, but you've got to understand that you've got various limitations and powers. Another key to success is interaction between township officials. Keeping up good lines of communication, making sure that everybody is working together and on the same page. Perhaps having retreats. You can have TOI come and do a closed session, basically retreat with your township board. If you've got kind of board issues where maybe some of the trustees and the supervisor or whoever it is sparring, people aren't understanding their roles, people are fighting at meetings, give TOI a call and they can come to your meetings and help kind of navigate perhaps a better understanding of how everybody should be working together. Then also common goals and objectives. Again, something like a retreat where you come up with, what is it that we want to be doing here in our township? What do we want to be accomplishing? So when a team works together, everything's great. Everybody's playing in unison, you're winning games, but it doesn't always work that way. Sometimes there are fights, sometimes there are problems. And so what happens then? I think there are some keys to failure, including power struggles, again, where we talked about one official wanting to kind of take over the other official's responsibilities, where people are attacking each other in the press and in public, where they're trying to score points, with the public, or personal attacks, where it goes beyond a disagreement with, what we should do with this piece of property or this program, and it starts to become personal. Smearing others in the press. I also think another key to failure is forgetting about the electors. If you go out there and you just try and do things on your own that the electors have to approve, that's going to be a key to failure. You're going to get down the road and you're going to find out everything you've done, all the money you've spent has been for naught, and you're going to run into a lot of problems. And of course, not following the law, not complying with the Open Meetings Act or FOIA, or understanding some of those things is going to be a key to failure. With that, I want to turn to some of the common issues that my township clients call with frequently, and issues I've seen over the years. The first we talked a little bit about, and that's about property. Buying, selling, using property. Again, as we talked about, the electors have complete control over real property. Under Section 30-50 in the Township Code, and this is another statute that I've included in the materials. In case you get really bored one night and want to read this statute, you can. But basically it says that the electors have complete control over the use of property. And that's a pretty broad statement. And let's take just a couple of examples. One is it says they've got control over the use of property. So if you've got a piece of property that's been vacant out there and you want to build some sort of a shelter or do something with it, and the board says, yeah, let's go do that with the property. Even though you own it, you need to go get the electors to approve that use. Let's talk about selling property. If you want to sell property, you first have to go through a very detailed process with the electors. Either at a special or an annual meeting, you need to have a written resolution approved. You have to have a legal description of the property. It has to say the zoning of the property. The resolution has to talk about the intent to sell the property. You have to state within that resolution whether or not you're going to use a realtor or whether or not the township board staff is going to conduct the sale. A lot of various things you have to do if you're going to sell property. You also have to get an appraisal and keep that on file. You then have to publish the resolution. And you have to determine, where the bids are going to be opened and who's going to open them, how you're going to sell it, those types of things. And you can accept the high bid or any other bid in the best interest as long as it's 80% of the appraised value. So if you're looking at selling property, one caveat you have to know here is if the bids come in under 80% of the appraised value, you cannot legally sell that property. You have to go through the process again or find a different way to sell that. So if you're thinking about selling property, be aware that there are some very stringent requirements on this. I had a township go through this last year. We just completed the sale this summer, and it took about a year for them to kind of go through all the various steps. I mean, it is time intensive, and there's some work to it. And if you try to do this, and you forget about this, we don't need to do any of this, and our board will just take care of it. We've got a willing buyer here. He's going to pay us a good price for it. Let's do this. And you fast forward to closing, and the title company says, okay, now show us evidence of your ability and your authority to sell this property. And you go and you call your attorney and say, well, what does all this mean? And you have nothing to give the title company. You're not going to be able to give clear title to the buyer. And for example, the piece of property we just sold, we had a big stack of documents we had to give the title company for them to give good title warranty on the property. Yes?
We've just moved into a newer, or we're in the process of moving into a newer building. We want to sell the older building. Can we do that by auction?
All right, the question is, they just moved into a new building. They want to sell the older building. Can they do that by auction? The answer, what'd you say?
No, not without the.
Well, yeah, somebody said without the electors. I mean, you could potentially, basically, what do you mean by auction? You're still going to have to do this resolution, and I'd have to go back and look at the specific language of the statute. But I think you can either set it up by doing it by staff or by a realtor. If you can do it by auction, by having an auctioneer in a public bid, type of a thing, which you may be able to do, you would still have to go through and have the electors approve that. So now that does differ from personal property, which we'll talk about in a second. I've never seen a real property sold at auction at a township. It's either been through a realtor or a closed bid process. Yes?
If you were doing it at auction, though, you'd still have to stick with the 80%, wouldn't you?
Oh yeah, if you stuck with auction, it'd still be subject to the 80%. And I don't want to tell you without looking back at the statute whether you can, formally do that or not. But if you can, you certainly would still have to comply with all these requirements.
Now, if we didn't do the auction, could we do it by sealed bids?
Yeah, the question is, if you don't do it by auction, can you do it by sealed bids? Yes. There are basically two ways that I've seen and I know of for sure in the statute. One is sealed bid, and you publish in the resolution, you say when those bids are due, and where they've got to be sent, and when they're going to be open. They have to be open at a regular township board meeting by your clerk. They then open those closed bids, and you award it to the highest bidder. And if it's at least 80% of the appraised value. So the electors can say we want to do it by closed bid, or they can say we want to use a realtor to do it. And then a realtor goes out and tries to, and you have to say what the commission is going to be and those kinds of things. But certainly you can do it by closed bid. Yes?
Can you let the bidders know ahead of time what the appraisal amount is?
Question is, can you let the bidders ahead of time know what the appraisal is? Yes. In fact, you have to give them a copy if they request it. It's got to be kept on file with the township. So, you can think, well, is that good or bad? But at least they're going to know I've got to at least bid that, and then, probably other people are going to bid higher, so it's not necessarily detrimental that that's public knowledge. Yes?
Can you sell the old building as is?
Yes. The question is, can you sell the old building as is? And the answer is yes, and that's how I've always done it before. The most recent transaction like this I had, the township owned kind of a small old school building, and that's where they had their meetings, and they were getting rid of that property and they built a new property. And they sold it as is, and they had they designated a day where if anybody wanted to come out and look at it, they could come out and look at it. They put that in the notice, and then they just sell it as is. And I don't think you probably are going to want to sell, property too much other than that in any other way. We're talking about these issues of selling property. This can be a very controversial issue, and I don't know if any of you in here have had controversy with property issues, but it's not uncommon if you're wanting to build a new township building or sell something. You very well could get a group or a contingency of people within the township that are against that don't like that think that's a waste of money, or think this is a better deal, or whatever they might think. And they're going to make sure that you're going through this process. And they're going to make sure that the electors are the ones approving this. And even if kind of the township board is moving in one direction, the electors might be pulling you back in a different direction. So just be aware that those issues do exist out there. Personal property. Personal property is different than real property. Obviously here we're talking about vehicles, we're talking about machinery, equipment, various things like that. Desks, computers, whatever it might be. Personal property, the electors do not have a say in that. This is also in the same statute that's attached to your materials. Anytime during the year, the township board can decide to sell personal property. All it requires is a vote of the township board. Also, anytime during the year, the highway commissioner can decide to sell the road district's personal property. All it takes is his or her own, grant of authority to do that, and that's fine. If the township board or the highway commissioner wants to sell real property, they then, instead of a resolution like we talked about before, they create a property sale notice. And the clerk publishes this, and you post it, and you identify the property on there, and then you look at a very similar process of saying when the bids are due, where they're going to be opened at a regular township board meeting by the township clerk, and awarded to the highest bidder type of a thing. Now, that is one way to do it. The other way applies thanks to a new law that was just put into an act that basically says you can sell public property, personal property, by auction or at an approved internet auction site. For example, eBay. So you could put, the town dump truck on eBay and sell it that way. That would be another alternative instead of doing all the closed bids. What does not constitute personal property, a sale, is a trade-in. So if you've got a dump truck and you're getting a new dump truck and you go and you trade in the old dump truck, you don't have to do anything special for that. If you are leasing your dump truck to another governmental body, the road district next door, you don't have to do any special process like this. If you are going to sell the dump truck to the neighboring road district, then you can do it without doing this process, but you have to first declare it as surplus property. If you declare it as surplus property, then you can go directly to the road district next door and sell it to them. Is there a question back there?
Just answer it.
Okay, yes.
What if you don't sell it, you just give it
Well,
away?
well, the question is, what if you don't sell it, you just give it away without board approval? Don't ever do that. That's the answer to that. You really need to look at, and get the fair value for what the piece of personal property is, and make sure that you go through that process. Because if you're just, giving, property away, maybe you can say, well, it's got no intrinsic value, or it's de minimis or something like that. But a piece of equipment like a truck or something like that, you're probably going to be able to assign some value. Maybe it's a trade back and forth, but this is an area where a lot of people are doing, transactions, and it's just important to remember that, if you're outright selling it, go through the bid process or put it on eBay. If you're transferring it to another governmental body, that's fine to do. Just make sure you're either declaring it as surplus property or you're leasing it. Yes?
I was going to say, if you've tried to use it as a trade-in, and then somebody comes and offers you more money for it than you get on a trade-in, maybe it's unlikely, but if that happened, would it be okay to sell it under those circumstances?
Okay, the question is, let's say you're looking at a trade-in and all of a sudden somebody comes and says, well, wait a second, I'll give you, twice that amount, just sell it to me individually. Well, I think that conservatively speaking, you would say, well, that's not technically a trade-in because that person you're selling it to isn't giving you something. You're then basically selling it privately, and to use that, you've got to use the bid process. Because if you've got one guy coming and saying, well, I'll give you this, you might have 5 others willing to give you even more, so you really get the best bang for the taxpayer's buck that way. Yes?
You got to keep in mind that it's the taxpayer's money that you're dealing with, not your own personal money.
That's exactly right. He said you got to keep in mind that it's the taxpayer's money that you're dealing with, not your own personal money. So you always want to make sure you get the best bang for your buck. Personnel issues. A common issue, as we talked about earlier, was who hires personnel within the township and who controls them. General assistance employees. They are controlled by the township supervisor. They hire them. They fire them. They set their policy, their manuals. Highway, road district employees, controlled by the highway commissioner. They're hired by the highway commissioner, fired by the highway commissioner. Assessor employees, again, the same, hired by the assessor. Cemetery board employees. This can be a little trickier. You got to find out exactly what kind of cemetery you have. But if it's under the Public Graveyards Act, always been of the opinion that probably since you're vesting control, their employees are controlled by the cemetery board trustees, but they're still technically employees of the township. And then the township board. Again, so they're going to have probably the cemetery employees, the cleaning crew, the receptionist, the administrator. Do any of you have a township administrator that you employ? Okay, so a few of you. So there are, bookkeepers. Those are going to be employees hired by the township board. So when you get to those employees, that's when you can go into closed session and talk about, okay, which one of these guys do we want to hire, or should we give this person a raise? That's when the township board's going to get involved. Not necessarily with the general assistance employees or the road district employees. The highway commissioner gets to have a meeting with himself where he talks to himself in the car and decides whether or not he wants to give his employees a raise or not. They don't have to go to the board for that kind of thing. Again, remember that you've got to have personnel manuals if those departments have over 5 employees. So it's important that you have those. Yes?
If indeed a administrative person was terminated by supervisor without board consent, would that, although it's Illinois is at will, would that person have a right to sue for wrongful termination?
Well, the question is, if a supervisor terminated an employee that was considered a township employee without the consent of the board or the knowledge of the board, would that individual employee have a right? That's a great question. I would hesitate to give an answer to that, partly because your township is my client, so I can't give out too much free advice. But I would say that I think that if a supervisor, and a lot of times the board doesn't understand their role in handling employees, and so they might not even understand that's technically a board employee, and the supervisor's the CEO. So if they're kind of, whether it's been lawfully or directly given this power to handle the employees, they probably are out there acting under color of law and authority. So, if the board didn't object to it, it's probably an acceptable thing to do. I think you probably could delegate to the supervisor, that control. But keep in mind that the township trustees could rise up and say, hey, wait a second, you've got no authority to fire that person. We need to have a meeting. We need to discuss if we want that employee or not. So just keep in mind that, we talked about this team and all of these different players. Well, all of these different players might have different employees and different areas of jurisdiction. So when you get issues like this, you really need to step back and look at, who is the true kind of employer here. And that gets us next to working with unions and collective bargaining agreements. How many of you have a union within your township? All right. A few of you do. And, in my opinion, unions in the township arena are becoming a little bit more frequent. I've seen general assistance unions. I know we've got an assessor union here. We've got, I'm now dealing with a cemetery union where the cemetery employees are becoming unionized. I've seen just general township employees. Obviously, there are situations where highway commissioner and road district employees become unionized. So there are all kinds of situations, and you have to remember that basically, if your township's got 5 or more employees that aren't exempt, your employees might have a right to form a union and to collectively bargain. And if they do that, that's okay. They've got that right under the law, and that just means they're going to get together and they're going to ask you for a written contract, and you then have to go out and negotiate that contract. It's not necessarily as scary as it seems, but it does happen, and you do have to be aware that they've got those rights, and you then go and you help negotiate a contract. I had a situation recently where in the last election, the highway commissioner was defeated, and he employed his son and his brother, and right after the election, the road district employees decided that they would unionize. Because they were afraid, I presume, that the guy coming in, might fire them or, change their terms of employment or something. So they filed a petition to organize, And within 5 days, they entered into an agreement with the road highway commissioner. And a couple days later, the highway commissioner is gone. And so the new highway commissioner comes in and walks in and is handed this union contract that was not very favorable to him, as you might imagine. And so we've been contesting that, and I think we've worked out something with the union where they're going to go back and they're going to, clearly they've got the right to unionize, but let's work out a fair agreement for everybody. And I think we're going to do that. But that raised an interesting issue, which was there's a provision in the Illinois Public Labor Relations Act that says you've got a right to enter into multi-year agreements, but only with the entity that's got appropriation power, which means the township board, because the township board approves the appropriation ordinance for the township. So one of the arguments that we raised in this situation was, yes, the old highway commissioner signed this agreement, but this agreement purports to be for 5 years. The term of the old highway commissioner and all 4 years of the new highway commissioner, and it was not approved by the township board, which has appropriation authority, and therefore it's not a valid agreement and not binding on the new highway commissioner. And I think that would be a good argument. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you do get a union in your township, even if it is the supervisor's general assistance employees or the highway commissioner's road district employees or the assessor's employees, if it's a multi-year contract, look at whether or not your township board also needs to approve the financing of that agreement. Because I know that there are people at the State Labor Relations Board that are of that opinion. So just one issue to look at when you're dealing with those situations. Do we need an attorney? This is the most self-serving part of my presentation. So if you're asleep, wake up now, get re-energized. How many of you do not have an attorney? Anybody? So there are a few. Most townships have an attorney. Most townships do not have an attorney at every meeting. Some larger townships with lots of issues going on do, but most townships do not need an attorney at every meeting. The overwhelming majority of my township clients just call me whenever an issue comes up and they have a quick question or something like that. Maybe they need a contract or a lease reviewed or a question on authority, and it's a quick conversation, and that's really it. But there are situations where I think you probably do need an attorney and are better served by having an attorney. For example, specifically when you're buying and selling property, when you're doing public construction projects, making sure you're in compliance with the Prevailing Wage Act, making sure you're in compliance with the bidding requirements. Those types of issues, it's always a good idea to have an attorney involved. They can get complicated, and if you get too far down the road and something hasn't been done right, it can end up costing you more money. Yes?
Should the township and the road district, the highway commissioner, have their own attorney?
Should the township and the highway commissioner have their own separate attorneys? And that's a great question, and I've got some clients where I represent both. I've got some highway commissioners where I only represent them, some townships where I only represent the township and not the road district. There really is no straight answer. It really depends on if there are issues between the two entities. If everybody gets along great, I would say there's absolutely no reason to have two different attorneys. If there are issues where people are questioning authority and various things, then yeah, it's probably a good idea or not a bad idea necessarily for the highway commissioner to have his own attorney. But really, there's not a whole lot of need for that. The assessor does not get their own attorney. The township clerk does not get their own attorney. The township trustees don't get their own attorney. I mean, it's really either the township's attorney, which is appointed by the supervisor, and the highway commissioner's attorney. So there's really no good or bad answer for that. Yes?
If a township is considering getting an emergency manager and going into a jurisdictional mitigation agreement with other municipalities, how does that affect, first of all, is the township have to have an insurance policy on this, be covered in case they're sued, or?
Well, if I understand your question right, you're looking at getting into an emergency management agreement with various other municipalities and government entities. And that's the exact type of thing you would probably want to have your attorney look at to make sure there's, the necessary indemnification, insurance requirements, and all those kinds of things. So, without knowing a whole lot more about the situation, I can't off the cuff comment on that. But that's a prime example of something that, you would have your attorney take a look at. And like I said, everybody knows that, township governments and all units of local government, they don't have, tons of money. Nobody wants to spend money on attorneys. So I would say, kind of be cognizant of your legal budget. Are you overusing your attorney? Are you underusing your attorney? And just, be aware that there are certain issues where you probably need to make sure you're doing things right. I had submitted a proposal to a township 3 months ago. They called and asked me for a proposal, and I didn't hear anything, and I thought, well, they must have just selected another attorney. And the supervisor called me yesterday, and he said, hey, I just want to let you know we did go ahead, and we're going to use you as our attorney. We didn't have anything come up for 3 months, but now I've got a question. I want you to do, this ordinance, and work on this issue. All right, that's fine. That's how most townships operate. And not everybody's the same, but I would say overwhelmingly that's how most people utilize a township attorney. The other thing I would say before I go on to here is, there are probably a lot of attorneys floating around here. These are all attorneys who focus and work in this area of the law, in township government. So, there are good attorneys who do township government law. There are obviously other attorneys who kind of work in this area too. But if you really want somebody that concentrates in this area, this is a good resource and a good place to meet those types of attorneys. What about an engineer? I've got a lot of clients who call up and say, we're going to construct a building or we're going to do this. And I say, well, don't you need an engineer to do that? Yeah, we probably do. And I say, well, do you have an engineer? And they say no. But I know somebody I can call, and I say, well, it's not quite that easy. Illinois has what's called the Illinois Professional Services Selection Act, which says that if you have a pre-existing relationship with an engineer, and it's a good one, you can use that engineer. But if you don't, then you have to go through this very convoluted process to hire a new engineer, which entails getting requests for proposals, advertising, getting qualifications from engineers, appointing a committee to review those qualifications, then numbering, okay, here's our preferred list of engineers. Okay, this guy's number one. Now we go out and we negotiate a price with that guy. If we can't afford him, then we go to number two on our list. It's a very convoluted process. It's not as easy if you need an engineer to just call up the guy down the street and have them come and do some work for you. So be aware that if you've got a project where you're going to need an engineer, be thinking about that ahead of time and be thinking about how you're going to find one. Now, maybe your township has used one in the past, you've had a good relationship with them, and you can still use them. That's fine. This also applies to architects and to surveyors. Engineers, architects, and surveyors, you have to use this process. Attorneys, you can just call up and hire. There's no issue with it. I presume because attorneys write the laws and they want to make it as easy as possible.
Sir, what were the three things that we really needed?
Engineers, architects, and land surveyors.
What about the county engineer?
A lot of times, yeah. A lot of times you'll use the county engineer. That's more of an intergovernmental type of a thing that the highway commissioner will work with the engineering at the county. But if you're looking at going out and building a building, the county engineer is probably not going to get involved in something like that. What do we do with all these documents? How many of you have township offices or some space in your township property where you just got stacks and stacks of documents? Several of you. And it piles up and continues to pile up. The question is, what do we do with all this? Should we just wait till spring, get a dumpster, go in there and clear them all out? And just clean everything up. Nobody's asking for these old documents anyway. The answer to that is no. The Local Records Act, I've got Retention Act, it should just be the Local Records Act up there, basically provides that you have to keep public records. What's a public record? There's a very, very long definition of public records. But basically it means anything, a document, a photograph, a map, anything that was made by the township or received by the township that has to do with the transaction of public business, and which should be kept to show evidence of procedures, decisions, activities. All, very long definition, basically saying anything that's in your township could be a public record. So you have to go through a detailed analysis if you're going to throw something away to say, wait, this isn't a public record. So my email about where we're going to go to lunch today, that's not a public record. My email about how the cemetery trustees are going to adopt this ordinance and our procedures and plans, that is a public record. So you've got two emails, one's a public record, one is not. You've got to do that analysis on everything you've got. Before you destroy something, you've got to get the public record, you've got to get the approval of the local records commissioner. You'll likely want to create a schedule of documents that you can destroy and do all of that. How many of you have used the local records commissioner before to destroy public records? So quite a few of you. If you're new in this position, let's say you're the clerk or you've got a township where there's just documents everywhere, this might be a good thing to start. It's not going to happen overnight, but start this process of reviewing public records and looking at what we can destroy, what we need to get the permission to destroy, and how we can document and archive some of these records. Yes?
Would that be just the original, or if I scanned a whole bunch of documents into a server, would that count? Could I then shred the original?
The question is that just the original document? What if I scan the documents into a computer, then can I throw away the hard copies? And the answer is basically no, because you can keep electronic copies, but before you destroy the hard copy, the local records commissioner will still require you to get permission and notify them that you're destroying that. And you can't just put your documents onto a floppy disk. It's got to be something that is going to stand the test of time and that we can get to in the future. So they've got requirements on exactly what type of electronic media you can keep those records on. I had a supervisor who was defeated in the last election, and we were looking for records, and we said, well, where are all the records? You were supervisor for 8 years. Surely you wrote a letter. Surely something is out there. And we scanned all the GA files. Everything scanned into the computer. And we said, and I called up the local records commissioner, and I said, was anything filed allowing for the destruction of these originals or these documents? And they said no. Last thing that was filed, it was like 1976. So that's an issue. And that's an issue because destruction of public records under certain circumstances can be a class 4 felony. The certain circumstances are basically where you're trying to commit fraud and you're doing it unlawfully. But still, you don't want it to be the test case. You don't want there to be a question about what your intent was or whether you were doing it fraudulently or not. You just need to be aware you should not be destroying public records. Make sure you go through the process. Make sure you have a process in place. Yes?
How do you get in touch with this commission?
The Local Records Commission, the question is, how do you get in touch with them? They're part of the Secretary of State. And if you just get on the Illinois Secretary of State's website, there is a link there for local records. And they will have all of the phone numbers and all of the information that you need. Sunshine laws. Real quick. FOIA and, yes, question back here.
Yes, one plate back. There you go. Is there any responsibility on a new administration for, let's just say, lost or unfound documents of a prior administration? We can't presume that they were destroyed, we don't know, but we can't find them.
The question is there any responsibility on a new administration that comes in, if they come in and all the file cabinets are vacant, what do you do then? And I've had more situations of this and this turnover than I've ever had before. And how we've handled it is to if that situation occurs, we send a letter, whether it be the highway commissioner or the supervisor, and say, look, here's the law, here are your requirements, here are your obligations. There are no records, where are the records? You've got an obligation to turn them over under the township code. You have to make a written request that, potential criminal penalties. Where are the records? If you don't respond, you don't turn them over, we're just going to turn this over to the state's attorney's office. So your question is, what is your responsibility? Number one, I would say, make a written request for the records. Say, it doesn't seem like this is right. It seems like there should be more. We're missing these types of records. Where are they? Make that written request. Call the local records commission if you want to take it to the next step and say, look, was anything filed? We've got these missing records. You can talk to the state's attorney's office about it, see if they want to get involved in it. Now, I think probably you're going to find most state's attorneys are going to be reluctant to get involved, but if it's a very serious issue, they might crack down on it, might look into it. But I would definitely write the request letter asking for them. A few quick tips, and you probably already had a lot of trainings on the Open Meeting Act and FOIA. With your township board, 2 trustees can get together and talk. That's fine. That's not a meeting. You can get together and talk. 2 trustees or a trustee and the supervisor can get together and talk about township business. There's no problem with that. 2 trustees and the clerk can get together. 2 trustees, the clerk and the highway commissioner can be together. Where the problem comes in is if you get 3 trustees or 2 trustees and the supervisor. That's when it's a meeting, and that's when you're no longer complying with the Open Meetings Act. If you're going to have a meeting, you've got to post it 48 hours in advance. If it's a regular meeting, 48 hours in advance. If you need to have a special meeting, post it 48 hours in advance and give the notice to the media. Another common thing here is to be descriptive on your agenda. Make sure if you've got a resolution or an ordinance, there's a new law in the Open Meetings Act that says it's got to be descriptive. So make sure that you're not just saying, an ordinance on township policies. If it's an anti-nepotism policy, write, an ordinance approving an anti-nepotism policy. Be descriptive so that if the common person out there can understand what type of business you're going to be acting on and what type of issues you're going to be facing at that meeting. Also on the Open Meetings Act, don't forget your semi-annual review of closed session meeting minutes. This is something that people get confused on. At least twice a year, as long as you've ever been in closed session in the history of your township, and you have closed session minutes to reflect that, at least twice a year, you should review to see whether or not those minutes should be kept confidential or open to the public. Twice a year you do that. And you probably then have minutes reflecting that. So you should always have 2 reasons to go into executive session. And you can determine, yes, let's still keep them confidential, or no, nobody cares that we thought about buying that piece of property 30 years ago. We can release those to the public. Yes?
We brought out the tapes to listen to them. Now, since we're a fairly new board, we assume there's minutes, but when we listened to the tapes, they were just a bunch of gibberish. But we kept them because we didn't know what we needed to do with them.
Well,
they were worthless.
the question is, they listen to the tapes because you've got to record your closed sessions. When they listened to them, they were a bunch of gibberish. I presume the trustees weren't speaking gibberish. It was some sort of mechanical error in the tape. But I would probably, you can destroy tapes after 18 months as long as the minutes have been approved. So you might be able to approve them for destruction. If it hasn't been 18 months, I would just wait the 18-month period. I would definitely go back, make sure your equipment is working now, make sure you get that problem fixed, because now that you've got knowledge of it, you want to make sure you're on top of that. On the FOIA, every seminar I ever talk to, I always make sure everybody remembers that your emails may be subject to FOIA. The courts have recently held if you're texting during a meeting or doing something like that during a meeting, even if it's on your personal device, it is clearly going to be subject to FOIA. Make sure you respond within 5 days to any FOIA request. Don't forget to include the appeal language. I see a lot of clients forget this, advising them of their right to appeal a denial or a redaction within a request. Make sure you keep copies of all of your letters and all of your FOIA responses. Yes?
Our assessor received a letter just a couple days ago from a person in California that wants the last 5 years of all of the assessment data for our township. I mean, that seems to me to be overburdensome.
Well, the question is, their assessor got a FOIA request for the last 5 years of assessment data for their township. And there's a provision in the Freedom of Information Act that basically allows you to object to categorical requests if they are unduly burdensome. And so your assessor very well may want to make an objection and require them to narrow that request down. And that is certainly a possibility. But remember that, you know, we don't get asked questions about why people are FOIAing information. We talked about the unions a little bit ago. One of the things that I do when I represent a union in a township is I will call other townships of similar size and ask them for salary information. So when we're looking at, you know, a general assistance or a cemetery union, I'll call up the clerks from other townships and say, hey, can you give me your salaries for these positions? And, you know, I'll be courteous and I'll tell them, here's why I'm asking for this, you know, so they're not automatically defensive about it. But I don't have to do that. I could just say, I want all your salaries. And that seems offensive to a lot of us, but they're public employees, and that is information that townships have to disclose. So just remember that a lot of this information is subject to disclosure. There are some exemptions. Be aware of those exemptions. And if you have questions on that, call your attorney. Most of my clients handle their FOIAs directly, unless it's a kind of a complicated or a controversial one. But it is something that I'm sure you guys can handle and take the necessary training and take the online trainings. Speaking of, make sure that you take all of the required trainings. There are basically 3 different types of trainings to be aware of. 1, your township needs to appoint an Open Meetings Act designee. That person has to be trained on an annual basis. 2, you've got a FOIA officer that you've appointed. That person has to take the FOIA training on an annual basis. And 3, all of you should have taken the Open Meetings Act training for elected officials. So there are 3 different types of trainings and people that have to be trained that you need to be aware of. Public comment. Question?
You went too fast for me.
Sorry.
That's okay. When you were talking about the closed meeting minutes and twice a year having a meeting and making a decision whether to open those to the public or keep them closed, how do you document such a thing, and how do you present that you are having these 2 meetings?
The question is, when you're having your closed session meeting to discuss whether or not minutes should be kept confidential, how do you document that? It should be reflected in the minutes. And typically what I will do is I will do a letter that says, and you could do this any number of ways, but sometimes I'll have a client who will ask me to review the minutes and make recommendations as to what should be kept confidential, what should be open. So I will actually have a letter where I will say, I recommend these be open, these remain confidential. And then when the board acts on that, that's something that's in the minutes and kept on file.
And that doesn't have to be noted to the public before you have the meetings?
On the agenda, it'll just have executive session to discuss, you know, closed session minute review. Yeah. And then you do have to come out and announce what your decision is. That does have to be public. You have to say, we are opening these, we are keeping these confidential. So, and you can just, you know, I verbally have clerks go over that at the meeting. Yes?
What are they going to do if you didn't do all of the training requirements? If I didn't do number 1, should I go back and do number 1? Is that initial training requirements on the computer?
Well, the question is, what if you don't do these training requirements? You will be arrested. You will go to jail. Yeah. If you don't do the training requirements, you know, you're subject to getting bad publicity, bad press. You're subject to the Attorney General coming and saying you've got to do these. But that's probably about the extent of it. If you haven't done them, do them. If you're both the Open Meetings Act designee and the new official, you only have to take, you know, the Open Meetings Act training once. So, you know, if that's,
But I did it in 13.
you're fine, yes. Well, the training for the elected officials is a one-time thing, but the Open Meetings Act designee and the FOIA officer are annual trainings. So it's a little confusing, but because sometimes it might overlap. You might be an elected official, you might also be the FOIA officer, and you might also be the OMA designee. So that means, lucky you, you get to take these trainings annually. But for the trustee that's not any of those things, they just have to take the Open Meetings Act once they got elected. Yes?
Has there been a question, sadly we get a lot of FOIAs, out of Chicagoland people. I suspect some of them may be news people, writers, whatever. And because if you send them via email, there's no restrictions. And I've had to send 60, 70, 80 pages. And no offense, but you know, to follow up to make sure they all went through, I found out that ones didn't go through, had to redo them. And I sent an email and said, can I just mail this to you? No.
Whoa.
You know, so I'm to the point that I would like to question that with the Attorney General's office because it's you know, because I could get in trouble because they didn't get them, but yet, you know, when you're trying to send that many pages over and...
Yeah, part of the problem is that FOIA allows people to request documents in the format of their choosing if that format's available, you know, to the township. So if they ask for it in an electronic format, you've got that capability, you've got to provide it. Now you would think if you're not going to charge them for the hard copies and it's easier, why can't I just send them the hard copies? Unfortunately, that's not the way the law is set up at this point. So I will try to help change that. Just real quick here, public comment. Does everybody have public comment on their agenda? Anybody not have public comment on your agenda? If you don't, you have to have it on there. I recommend you have a public comment policy. You can limit people to three minutes. You can limit it to, you know, township-related matters. Don't let them come talk about the war in Afghanistan or whatever. Keep it to township matters. You don't have to answer them. It's public comment. It's not public interrogation or deposition. So you can tell them, look, we just want your comments now. I'll talk to you about this later. That's a perfectly fine response. And remember to be fair. Don't let your enemies, don't give your enemies 1 minute or shut them down completely and let your friends speak for hours. If you do that, you might get sued, you might be personally liable, and you don't want that. Just let everybody, you know, be courteous. You know, don't let them go up there swearing and yelling and those kinds of things, but let them speak their piece and move on. Vacancies, obviously the township board's got the right to fill vacancies. Remember, there's a time limit on this. You really need to do this within 60 days to make sure that the township board's got control to do it. Otherwise, it definitely goes to the electors if it's a township board position. Any other position, there's an argument that the township board loses jurisdiction and it goes to the electors as well. I think that's iffy and might get resolved in court, but there are those issues. Make sure you've got the policies that you need. We talked about various policies, personnel manuals. I have townships that have credit card use policies. If you have credit cards in your township, you definitely want to make sure you've got a policy on that. Make sure you've got Identity Theft Protection Act policies. If you rent out rooms to the public or other space, you want policies on that. Make sure if you might want an anti-nepotism policy. There's just all kinds of different things that you might need policies on. So do a review, see what you need, see what you have, see what you need to update. And with that, we're running short on time here. We have a couple minutes for questions. Otherwise, if you have questions, you can always feel free to contact me. My phone number, email information is up here. Like I said, I work with townships throughout the state of Illinois, all far south to far north. I'd be happy to help you in any way I can. But are there any questions before we leave? Yes.